AP 120, Chapter 5, Topics: Epithelial Tissues. So we are moving up the chain to tissues. And a tissue is a bunch of similar cells working together for a similar purpose. So they're cells very similar to each other, came from the same area back when we were an embryo, and they're now working together to do something. There are four main categories of tissues. We have epithelial tissues that line surfaces, we have nervous tissue, muscular tissue, and the very diverse connective tissues. We'll start with epithelial tissue. Epithelial tissue is the tissue that lines every surface and cavity in our body. So it includes the inside of hollow organs, inside of cavities. Our skin is epithelial tissue on the very surface area. So that means epithelial tissue is always near an open space or lumen. Now that space, that lumen, might be filled with some sort of fluid, or gas, but it is an open space where there aren't other distinct tissues. Now epithelial tissue also makes up glands. And what are some examples of glands? I'm sure you can think of a lot of examples of glands. We have salivary glands, we have mucus glands that produce mucus, we have a lot of different kinds of thyroid gland, pituitary gland. There's a lot of glands out there. All right. One characteristic of epithelial tissue is that it has no blood vessels. So it is avascular, no blood vessels. And it also possesses little to no extracellular matrix. So it's almost all cells, sheets of cells, except for a thin extracellular structure called the basement membrane that helps attach the epithelial tissue to the underlying tissue. So when we look at epithelial tissue, and here's a lovely cartoon of some epithelial tissue, we have the lumen, that open space. Then we have the epithelial tissue, also called epithelium. It has an apical surface, a free surface exposed to the lumen. Directly underneath the epithelial tissue would be a basement membrane. It's a non-living structure made up of protein fibers that attach the epithelium to the underlying connective tissue. So, functions of epithelial tissue. Well, there's the physical protection function. In the cases, it's usually a multi-layered structure that allows for the surface layers to get removed from bumps, abrasions, friction, without any damage to anything underneath. So examples of where this function is important is in the mouth, the esophagus, the skin, the rectum, the vagina, lots of places. Then we have absorption. Some epithelial tissue functions to absorb materials into deeper tissues of the body or into the bloodstream. And then we have secretion. Secretion, the release of materials that the body may need. So absorption, what are some systems where that occurs? Digestive system, urinary system, respiratory system. Secretion, where does that occur? That occurs in a lot of places. So things that can be secreted: mucus, saliva, tear fluid, lots of things, gastric juice. And another function is the movement of extracellular materials. So sometimes the material in that lumen is material that the cell needs to cause to move. And almost always the cells therefore have on their apical surface these hair-like structures that are able to beat and move the material substance. And these structures are of course called cilia. So for instance, in our respiratory system, a lot of the cells lining the respiratory tract have cilia that will beat to move mucus away from the lungs, for instance. All right, epithelial tissue. Epithelial tissue is classified by two main characteristics: by the layers and by the cell shape. When it comes to layers, it's defined by how many layers. If the layer is just a single layer, that is called simple. So simple epithelium has a single layer of cells. If it has two or more layers, then it's called stratified. So two or more layers, you now have stratified epithelium. And then there's a hybrid called pseudostratified. With pseudostratified, it's technically one single layer of cells, but the way they are positioned makes it confusing to make it almost look like it has multiple layers. So pseudo for false, it's false layers. All right, and then by cell shape, three main cell shapes that we look for: squamous or flat, cuboidal, where it's about as tall as it is wide, and columnar, where it's much taller than it is wide. And when we talk about cell shapes, we're talking about the cells near the lumen, near that open space. Those are the ones we look at for the shape. So again, two categories: layers, simple, pseudostratified, stratified, and shape, squamous, cuboidal, and columnar. So here is a tissue. I'll give you a second to determine what kind of tissue it is. Hopefully you got simple squamous, one single layer of thin cells, simple squamous epithelium. It is found in the air sacs of the lungs, walls of blood capillaries. It lines blood vessels, and it tends to have important functions related to diffusion, movement of materials across the thin cell layer, and filtration. So, for instance, gas exchange occurs across simple squamous tissue in the lungs. All right, here is another tissue. What would be this called? Hope you came up with simple cuboidal epithelium. So single layer of cube-shaped cells. Again, they don't look like perfect cubes, but they are basically as tall as they are wide. Here's another strip of this simple cuboidal epithelium. It's found in locations like the kidney tubules and the glands, especially tubes of glands. And its functions include secretion and absorption. So they could be producing a secretion, they could be absorbing some sort of material, and they could be more structural to just have a tube for things to move through. Here is another tissue type. Let's see in this slide here. And it is called, take one from layer, take one from shape, simple columnar epithelium, simple columnar. So these are cells are definitely longer than they are wide, and there's only one layer of these cells. Simple columnar can be ciliated or non-ciliated. Ciliated means, surprise, surprise, it has cilia. Non-ciliated means it lacks cilia. So locations, you can find non-ciliated simple columnar epithelium in places lining the uterus, the intestines, the stomach. But they do tend to have tiny cell protrusions called microvilli. Microvilli are just little areas where the cell membrane pushes out a bit, forming these tiny finger-like projections that increase surface area. So here, these cells, that little fuzzy border is the microvilli. Then we have ciliated simple columnar epithelium, and that's found, for instance, in the uterine tubes. So the cilia beats, it moves fluids in the uterine tube, which then moves the oocyte toward the uterus. So functions, the non-ciliated version is involved in protection of underlying tissues, in secretion of substances such as mucus, so this dark red stuff is supposed to be mucus, and absorption, very important in the intestines, absorbing nutrients. And for ciliated, it has an important function for the movement of the oocyte. How about this tissue here? Again, choose from each category. Turns out this tissue is pseudostratified columnar epithelium. Again, taller than they are wide. If you look at it, you can see a few cells that seem to go from top to bottom. Other cells, you can't tell for sure if they're making it all the way to the top or not. Turns out they are. And the nuclei are scattered. They're not in one row. They're all over the place. So those are keys to tell that this is pseudostratified. Places we find it is lining the trachea and the bronchi. And when it lines the trachea and bronchi, it'll have cilia, and then it is able to move mucus and the substance is trapped in the mucus so that the mucus goes away from the lungs up toward the throat. All right, what is this tissue called? One from layers, one from shape. It is stratified squamous epithelium. Many cell layers, pretty obvious. Look at the cells near the surface, and they are very flat, so they are squamous. Places where you find stratified squamous epithelium includes the outer layer of the skin, also known as the epidermis, found in the mouth and throat. Throat's also known as pharynx. And its purpose is protection. It protects underlying tissues. Basically, with all these level layers and the constant production of new cells, this tissue is able to lose some of the cells on the surface and not suffer any real injury. Keratinization. Some stratified squamous epithelium is keratinized, specifically the epidermis. And this produces dry, waterproof protective layers. So the skin's protection is also waterproofing and tougher to be able to resist more abrasions. All right, what about this lovely tissue here? Category. It is stratified cuboidal epithelium. Stratified cuboidal epithelium is in many glands, mammary, salivary, sweat glands. It's in the pancreas. It's in seminiferous tubules of the testes, so quite a few places. And its functions includes protection, so it will protect underlying tissues, and also structural in that it just helps to form very stable tube-like structures for materials to travel through. All right, here is another image. What kind of tissue is this? Well, it turns out it is stratified columnar epithelium. So you can see that it's two layers. The bottom layer, the cells are shorter, but the upper layer, cells are longer than they are wide. See the nuclei are all lined up pretty nicely. There's not a lot of stratified columnar epithelium, but you can find it in the male urethra. And its function is a protective function. Turns out ejaculation is a very powerful force. And surprise, we have one more epithelial tissue, and this is called transitional epithelial tissue. Transitional epithelial tissue has many layers, and what happens is that it's found in the structures of the urinary system, like the urinary bladder. When the bladder is relaxed because you've urinated, then the transitional epithelium has nice rounded spherical-esque cells, but then as the bladder fills, the cells will stretch as the urinary bladder stretches and become flat. So they transition from this more cuboidal rounded state to a squamous state. And they are found, urinary bladder, urethra, functions, stretch under pressure. Glands. Glands are made of epithelial tissue. Glands can be individual cells, or they can be multicellular organs like the thyroid gland, parathyroid glands, pancreas. Glands perform secretory functions. So glands secrete things like mucus, hormones, enzymes, and waste products. There are two big categories for glands. There's endocrine glands and exocrine glands. Endocrine glands have no duct, so they don't reach the surface, and instead they secrete their substance, which is hormones, into the surrounding fluids of the tissues or into the bloodstream. So either into the interstitial fluid or the bloodstream. Exocrine glands, on the other hand, have a duct that leads to a surface, so that what they produce and secrete ends up going onto that surface. So these three glands, endocrine or exocrine. Hopefully you figured it out. Sweat glands, salivary glands, exocrine. Thyroid gland is endocrine. That is it for this part of Chapter 5.